think we're live. So hello and welcome to the Bible School Show live Q&A. This is particularly just every month a chance to answer some questions which you might have either from the show or even outside. We're willing to answer any questions you have, and hopefully we are able to. So one of the things we've got is we've still got some questions left over from last month. So I wanted to, hey Philip, wanted to cover some of the questions that we left over from last month. So we're only able to cover a few, and I think we still have even more actually as well. But we're going to dive straight in with our first question. So this one I'm going to direct to PJ, but I think there's something to cover first. So I'll ask this first question. How much can we trust the authors who recorded St. Andrew's encounter with dog-headed people and the account of St. Peter going to be crucified in Rome? Or more broadly speaking, should we trust historical sources outside the Bible? So on that dog-headed issue, particularly, can we trust those events?
Okay, but before PJ answers that, I just want to flag up two books that he's written and published just recently. First, there's one on Michaelmas, but what Michaelmas is down through church history. This one, it's available on Amazon. Michaelmas down through church history. Michaelmas is the feast. It's the feast that lasts. What times of the year does it last, PJ?
In the modern Western calendar, I think it's September 29th, and then it depends exactly what we're looking at, because His Majesty's revenue will follow like quite a medieval thing, so I think that will often, Michaelmas will last longer there. And a Michaelmas term in university, doesn't that last into December? Or
Yeah, it's basically the autumn term, so it's like that sort of time period. And it's really all about the archangels. So this book is all about how the archangels have been understood through church history, and I've loved it. It's been amazing, and the concept of there being 7 archangels, because we all know Michael and Gabriel, but there are 5 others, and how do we know that for sure? Well, I'm not going to tell you. You've got to buy the book. And then there's another one on All Hallowtide down through church history. Now, what's All Hallowtide?
so that is this 3-day feast, 3-day season or 3-feast season we've had recently, which is Halloween, All Hallows, and All Souls. But you know, again, it can, like with Michaelmas, it can last a bit longer or shorter depending on who's asking and who's asking whom. So you know, it could last till Martinmas, which is the 11th, because that used to be called Old Hallowmas Eve. Still kind of is. Or it could last all the way to Advent.
What's it about, Old Hallowtide?
So it's about Jesus' victory over death, and the whole curtain that divides us from heaven, his victory over all of that. So we think about the saints, because you have all saints, you got all souls, because like a saint, you know, from the medieval period onward, it's someone we know is in heaven, so they've done this investigating, so they know that person's all right. But All Souls, it's time to think about people where like there hasn't been like a formal investigation to know this person's in heaven. But it's like someone you know from your life.
It's really to do with what that divide between life and death and the intermediate state. What happens to you when you die, and what about, like, because they're often at Halloween people get into like ghosts and goblins and things like that. So there's a lot in the book about those kind of subjects, creatures as well, that are in that kind of like borderland between heaven and earth, life and death, and so on. But let's not get too much more. Who the author is? PJ here. PJ's written these 2 books. This one is Michaelmas. That's about the archangels. And then All Hallowtide, that one's the, like I've just been talking about.
Which the cover of the Halloween one, you were just saying.
Oh, yeah.
It's covering some of the creatures that touch these two realms, and that's got a
Hold it up and let him explain that picture.
So that is a gnome. Sadly, yeah, and he's sadly overlooking the first train, and I do explain in the book why that's a sad thing. Why a gnome would be sad about it. Why we should be sad about it too if we understand gnomes properly. And why all this stuff comes from, like gnomes, the whole idea of gnomes comes from Christian thought, Christian theology, and now it's just a part of like what we think about creatures and everything, but it's like a really Christian thing, and really connected with what tends to be thought about as we thought the curtain and everything in it. It's all about that sort of thing. So gnomes are a great way of looking into it. So that's why I had him on the cover. And now we should be sad about our kind of machine-like modern world we've created. And we got rid of a much more interesting way of understanding the universe, one that is more true, more close to what we see in the Bible. And we gave all that up. We gave gnomes up for trains. Is it a good trade-off?
Hang on. One caveat, because I studied mechanical engineering, I feel I have to defend it a little bit, reading recently on Hezekiah, who invented new technologies. Do you remember, on the castle wall?
That's true.
So invention technology is in the Bible, but the creatures are far cooler.
Yeah, it shouldn't be done to the exclusion of gnomes. That's
definitely.
the big lesson.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the lesson
Well,
for today.
now, what about answering the question then?
Yes.
Right, yes. So
why should we trust all these? Because you often refer us to incidents in church history that are not in the Bible, but they mention people, other people that are like, it's about people who are in the Bible, but the stories you tell us are outside the Bible. And people often are worried. They take the view, like, because people will trust. If you said, here's the history about Julius Caesar, who's the same time period, like New Testament, really, they will believe that. But people are nervous about believing history that involves Bible characters.
Yeah.
Aren't they? Because it's this sense that, well, we've got to trust the Bible absolutely. Whereas if you listen to these other sources, does that undermine the Bible? And are they trustworthy? So why do you trust them?
So I think, as you were saying with Julius Caesar and, loads of manuscripts and so on that talk about him, they are from centuries after him. But everyone feels like, we know he's real and that sort of thing. We know these stories are real. And it's a strange double standard. And there'll be things as well, like Islamic traditions about what Muhammad supposedly did, hadiths. They will also be centuries afterwards, but you get non-Muslim people just quote it's like, Muhammad totally said this, and it's like, well, no, like, following the same standard by which we hold early Christianity and the knowledge we have about early Christianity, we don't know anything about the life of Muhammad. Or similarly, there's loads of Jewish oral traditions which might have only been written down for the first time 1,000 years after Jesus. But it's about the time period of Jesus, and people will just believe it. And there'll be something that seems to be said in the Gospels, and they'll say, you can't be saying that because that contradicts this oral tradition that was written down 1,000 years after Jesus. So we've got to make sure that we're treating all oral traditions, all of these kind of manuscripts and everything, equally, and that we don't have a much harsher standard towards Christian things than we do other traditions, because that is basically the norm. And you'll be surprised how much stuff is just taken for granted by historians, probably by ourselves. Like the whole concept of a Sanhedrin, there's loads of...
People often mention the Sanhedrin in sermons and things.
Yeah. And it's sometimes in translations, I think maybe the NIV mentions Sanhedrin and so on. And this is from the Talmud, which is a compilation of oral traditions from centuries after the time of Jesus. But people trust it so much. All this idea of there being a constitution to ancient Israel with certain laws and governing bodies and all of that is trusted more than what we see in the Gospels, which are actually written in the kingdom of Israel. So it's just keeping that in mind. So I think that's part of it, like how we deal with oral traditions. So I think it's fine to trust oral traditions, and everyone seems to agree with that, because as I said, everyone uses them all the time. But we've got, and if anything, as Christians, we believe our traditions more. So, like, saints, because these stories get passed on by saintly people, and we see the wonderful things they did through Christ and everything. And that to us does signify that they're not liars. Maybe they misinterpret things, and we can maybe say that, but they're not liars. We can't hold that to be true. So again, that's one of the reasons there's these different oral traditions people hold to. Like Jewish people think, our God will preserve our truths and everything so we don't fall astray. And it's like, I understand why you'd believe that. That's fine for you to believe. But then Christians have to then think, well, our God also was working through the saints and everything. And when the saints teach us stories, and when they're sure of these things, they're not liars. Maybe they're wrong and everything, but they're not liars. And that does mean we've got to take these things more at face value. This is a genuine report by an honest person.
And a good example I found is I was talking to someone who was a big fan of St. Augustine, and they were talking, St. Augustine, what amazing Christian, brilliant thinker, and they said, okay, but then I mentioned something that Augustine refers to like fey creatures in North Africa, and he said, well, you can't believe all of it. And I'm like, but you've just said he's like a super reliable, trustworthy thinker and a great intellect. But because he says something that doesn't fit the way you see the world, like now you're like, but yeah, he's unreliable on that. But it's that sense that I understand it, but it's just a way of saying, isn't it, that if we believe these Christians were godly people who were not liars and not trying to deceive, but simply trying to tell the truth about what happened to them and what they saw in the world, then that means, okay, other non-Christians might say, I don't believe Christians. Okay, fair enough. But surely Christians believe Christians.
Absolutely. And when you think, because Johnny was bringing up this, as we were talking before, this amazing letter written by Ratramnus. Again, someone people think very highly of. He gets quoted on all these theological and scientific and philosophical ideas. But he's got a letter called Concerning Dogheads. And there's a minister who's written to him who says, we've got all these dogheads, and do we set up a missionary activity with them? Do they need to be converted? Are they human? Or do they, whether or not they're human, does that mean they require church? And he basically writes back saying, yeah, I think they do. And he gives his reasons. But then this was a genuine pastoral problem in the middle of all these other pastoral problems. He's written all these letters, and you'll get this compilation and like very serious, very real things he deals with. And in the middle of all of it is this question of how do we deal with dog heads?
Because am I right if I summarize that the problem was, do they have a human or a dog soul, essentially?
Yeah.
Because I just mentioned it because I love animals in the Bible, so this is a reason I want to mention. They were saying if it's a dog, inherently it's a dog person, then they don't need saving because they're already saved. The Bible's kind of clear on that. The animals know that the Lord is God. But that was the pastoral problem. Do they need saving? Because the question is, are these dog-head people, are they human-spirited or dog-spirited? Because if it's dog-spirits, they don't need to be saved. They're already saved. If it's humans, we do need to save them. We do need to help them.
And also this kind of, when you really inhabit the world of the Bible, the way you think is so differently that this sort of stuff becomes more believable. Because, and in that book, you'll see there's passages of these kind of creatures. You get satyrs and fauns and centaurs destroying Edom, things like that. But it's interesting with this Ratramnus passage, the way he talks about it, like trying to determine whether they're human or not, because he's quite concerned that dog heads don't seem to be able to look up, because like dogs don't, and we think of our own dog, he often trundles around like that, and he's saying, well, to have like a soul, a human soul, you're kind of like got to look up to heaven and everything,
because the Bible speaks about, is it wood lice? Or
all creepy crawlies spend too much time looking at the ground.
So he feels that is a point of concern for like dogheads, and he's like, that's a point in them not having a human soul for him. He's like, they don't lift up their head quite like a human does. But then there's other things that make him think, oh, they do seem to be, and think overall he thinks, yeah, they are. But it's just interesting that kind of biblical logic he uses.
So you're saying that when you read these sources, it's not like they are writing a fictional story or something. They're just writing about normal life things, and then in that they'll include things that we find fantastical and marvelous. But they write about them often as if it's just, well, everyone knows this. This is part of life. And so it's like, we can't, unless, I suppose not, like, say, non-Christians do go, Christians made it all up. I don't believe the Bible. They made it up. And I definitely don't believe Christians anywhere else. They make it all up. But we don't think people made things up either in the Bible or outside the Bible. We kind of, I like the 1 Corinthians 13, love always thinks the best. So we think the best, certainly, of our brothers and sisters in church history.
And when we think, are we going to slander the names of like Augustine and Athanasius in his life of St. Anthony? He mentions that Anthony befriended a satyr and a centaur guided him to Paul the Hermit. So like, are these saints liars? Like, building on that point, it's like, so not only just like we should think the best of all Christians, but then there's like some people, like so much of our theology, we're like, well, you got to trust Athanasius, and I think that's right. But then, so we think he's not a liar when it comes to really big, super important things like God, and then, but we think like he's lying all the time about other stuff, and it's like, you can't have it both ways.
Yeah. There's also perhaps a good mention as well, just at the beginning of Luke says deliberately that he wants to give a thorough account of Christ so that people who read his gospel can trust it. So it's a good thing as well to think highly of those early saints, because they thought quite highly of truth. They wanted you to know what they speak about Christ is true. They made sure that they were, and Luke especially, he begins his gospel by saying, I want you to be sure of what Jesus did and said and what happened to him. So it's a good thing to trust these sources, because those early Christians take it very seriously that what they're speaking the truth. And perhaps one just other specific question on this one. Could you say anything just on another reason you can trust, say, specifically with the dog-headed people, and particularly St. Andrew's encounter with them? Is it just one source, or are there a few people talking about it?
It comes from the Abdian corpus of texts. So the Apostle Abdius, he's one of the 72 apostles. He travelled with Simon and Jude for some time, and they left him as the Bishop of Babylon. So he, again, if we're thinking of like early saints that we should take seriously and everything, an apostle has got to be way up there. So at one point it was doubted whether or not he wrote all the works, or that all of it was just made up. But then recently there's been, people look again at it and people find they will, because he's written all these lives of the 12 apostles and some of the 72. And when people didn't get all his books, they would throw in other books they had that were on the same theme. So some of those books would refer to something in like 1000 AD, and then they're like, look, that means Abdius was made up in the 1200s or something. But that isn't the case. They just put in books so that we got the whole story, these compilers, and they actually, looking at it again, gave little signifiers to say, oh, this wasn't written by Abdius, this is a later thing. So with all that in mind, people have looked again and thought, actually, the Abdian corpus of apostolic literature is very ancient, because we see it in Syriac texts, we see it in German, in Ethiopia, North Africa. It spreads around really quickly, really early. And when we think Ethiopia, they preserve like Enoch and Jubilees and other things, because they're very isolated, especially after the rise of Islam, from Europe. So the fact they have these stories in their own recension and interesting history of it is evidence to its antiquity and so on. So that's the Abdian corpus specifically with that story, and that's in the Ethiopian Sanhedrin. It's got other wonderful stories about dog heads, like Matthew and James son of Alphaeus going to King Christopher of the dog heads, who's an ancestor of the later Christopher, and baptizing him. So that's in the Ethiopian Sanhedrin, and it's a similar sort of thing where they've got these stories which really seem to be from the same kind of sources, but so they attest to something more ancient than what these other texts we have in Europe and everything are, which means the whole thing seems to be on a surer foundation than we thought. So yeah, that's all that specifically with that. Then it's a very ancient thing.
Good.
And if you, I'd just seen as well, Philip was saying never heard of dog heads, just on that as well, if you just Google Saint Christopher, is it?
Yeah.
And you'll see there is a dog-headed saint. When we get to heaven, we're going to meet a dog-headed Christian who's with us, at least one.
At least one.
So you can look up Saint Christopher, definitely.
Yeah.
Right, okay, so that was the first question. We've got a second question, which I was going to pose to you. So I'll just read it. So that first section. In light of the connection of spirit and breath in biblical texts, in the Bible, how does that relationship influence our interpretation of God's role to us, or his relation to humanity?
Yeah, to humanity. Yeah, it's so interesting that people, particularly in the post-Enlightenment modern world, tend to think of human beings as kind of secular or atheist. And people think of themselves as an atheist, and as you know, the Bible says we're without God in the world. So there is a way in which, human beings, if they're not trusting Jesus, don't have God attached to them. That's true. But there's another way, is like we were designed not to be without God in the world, but to only know everything experienced with God, and even we as Christians, the Bible says, be filled with the Spirit, or continually be filled with the Spirit, as if in this present age we leak, and that the Spirit leaks out of us all the time, and it's like we've got to breathe the Spirit back in and be filled continuously. So there's this way in which we've been designed so our bodies take air in, and then that's taking in oxygen that we need for life, and then we breathe out, and then we breathe out the things that we don't need so much in our bodies. And even just that little pattern of breathing, breath in, and then we let out too in that way. But the Spirit it's teaching us something about air, and that you can't see the air, but air gives us life. And then increasingly people look to the air and wind for power. And we make all these wind things to extract power from, because there's this awareness, wow, there's almost infinite energy available via the wind. And if we could harness it rightly, and then, ships used to move only by the power of wind and so on, and windmills and things. But this idea that there's around us this invisible force that gives us life and has great power. And even Jesus in John 3 talks about the wind blows wherever it will, just as it is with the Spirit. So what we've got to learn to do is realize that we've been designed to have this incredibly intimate relationship with the living God, to be brought to the Father through the Son by the Spirit. And that almost you'll get in ancient, certainly there's a medieval prayer, I couldn't just find it in time, I was trying to find it, that's all about, every time I take a breath, Lord, may I remember how much I need to take in your Spirit. And just that you can't, if you can't breathe, you perish. You perish. And same with water. Think of the things that are the symbols of the Spirit, air and water in the Bible, and how you can last a few days without water, but you will die. But air, you really quickly will no longer be able to think. You'll lose consciousness and then lose life entirely. So we've been designed to, it's as if he's saying to us, just as your physical body cannot survive without air, so you in your very soul and spirit, your mind and spiritual life, cannot survive without the living God. And that when our ancestors ate that fruit, and he said, the day you do that, you will surely die. It's like now you're no longer connected to the Spirit. And though your body can continue to breathe in air, and it's the same word, air and spirit, though your body does that, you are not any longer taking in the Spirit of God. You're out of breath. You're what's that word? If you're, is it not asphyxiate? Is it asphyxiate? Yes, asphyxiate. Yeah. You're asphyxiating. In your deepest core, and we feel that, when before you believe in Christ, before you're connected to God, that concept of that you're asphyxiating, you're dying, drowning in, like you're surrounded by this ocean of chaos, kind of, but you can't actually breathe the life you need. That is what it's like. So always those connections, breath and spirit, the Bible's asking, there's loads of passages where that comes out, that connection between breath and spirit. Even just the way Jesus breathed his last and then said, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." And that spirit and breath connection, it's in the book of Job a lot. What were you thinking of the Job ones? Have you got one in mind?
I've got one, Job 33:4. The Spirit of God has made me, the breath of the Almighty gives me life.
Yeah, it is. The breath of the Almighty gives me life. And so that way in which it should be that we people like to do what they call breathing exercises, and they do it just because they're kind of chilling out, and it's like breathe in and then slowly let it out. Breathe in, slowly let it out. Well, that's not a bad thing to do, so long as while you're doing it, you actually are meditating on this really big truth. That, it's good for your body to take in good lungfuls of air, but how much more your spirit and your mind need to take in. I don't know where, it's not a lungful of the Spirit, but take in the Spirit of the living God, the life of God, the light of God, like that. And so we've been designed to constantly remind us of that. And every time I'm out and I see people breathing, and I'll see, or a person out of breath, and they're like, oh, I'm thinking to myself, do they realise how much they're feeling the need of physical air? Do they feel the same urgency, the need of spiritual air, the Holy Spirit of God?
Yeah. So
you know that book of that Russian saint, or that saint from the Russian Empire, on the acquisition of the Holy Spirit? Do you know that one?
Yeah.
And in that one, he does talk about kind of why you gotta hate sin so much, and I think meditating on that whole thing, how it wages war on your soul, and how the Spirit is grieved by sin.
Yeah,
and that's
Ephesians 4. Yeah, I had that. Yeah.
Yeah, the Spirit is grieved by sin, which is the most intense emotion. And so when people are not full of the Spirit and everything, and it's sometimes they might feel oh, why has God abandoned me in a way? But it's they've chased the Spirit away, and when you're holding on to sin and things like that. And so it's you've got to, because people often do think, oh, I've got this heavenly fire insurance sort of thing, I'm fine, I don't have to think about sin and holiness and things. But then he's kind of no, because if you take all of that seriously, how much you need the Spirit every single day, how it is like breath, how it is surviving without Spirit is like surviving without breathing. You can't do it as a Christian, and that sort of thing. And that helps us take a lot of sin and holiness and all of this quite seriously.
Yeah. And on animals as well, in the Psalm 104, they sense if the Spirit is not with them, and they get anxious if that's the case. So, yeah. Jonathan, before we move on to another question, can you explain to people how to sign up for the Bible School show?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
what it involves. What do they get if they do sign up, and why is it worth doing? How to do it? Go on, you do it.
So, as we've been saying, we've still got more questions, but just some of these questions have come from the Bible School show, which this is the live Q&A of. If you'd like to join, or if you're having trouble joining, we can talk and hopefully help that. But if you'd like to join...
Let me just say on that, if a person's got trouble...
Yes.
And because one or two people have tried to sign up and it hasn't worked for them, and we don't always know exactly why. If there's any difficulty like that, because the £6 a month or anything like that, just email us and we can work around that. And you can send us a check and we can do a price for a whole year, things like that. Yeah. So don't worry. We can. There are ways to work around if you're having any difficulties.
Definitely. Yeah. And if you'd like to try to sign up, you can do it on our website. One word is Bible School, and then .show. It should be in the description, or I'll put it again in the comment sections in a bit. But if you go to bibleschool.show, and then if you scroll down, there'll be some payment plans. You can select one of them, and they'll take you through to a screen. Those payment plans will contain, each one will contain the entire Bible School show. I think that's currently the 4 terms. But then it'll also include, we've got some bonus content coming, some interviews that we're trying to add as well recently, but also the Bible School show study program, which that's going to be this adaptation of the Bible College in a Box, where we're looking for over, say, 3 or 4 years to read through the books and kind of education that you'd hopefully get from a theological college. The idea is
better than that,
even better,
because we actually believe.
That's true. So that's what we're hoping to do with the Bible School show study program, which again you'll get if you sign up through one of those payment plans on the website. But again, if there are any payment problems, please email us. We can sort out a solution.
Right.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Right. So I've got another question.
Hang on. Let me ask you one that came in from Dom. And he asked, if you think about the way that Jacob greets Esau after they've been away from each other for a long time, are there any parallels to be seen between that incident in Genesis and in the prodigal son story, where the prodigal son's coming home and the father rushes out to embrace him? Have you thought about that? Have you looked at that?
I did. I was looking when I heard the question, and love it, of course. Because it is so fantastic, especially because in the prodigal son, he's coming back with nothing, and Jacob is actually kind of making sure that he meets Esau with nothing. He essentially, the way the story goes, he comes to greet Esau when he's kind of either given everything away, or most of it, or he's kept kind of some things back, but essentially he comes to Esau alone. It's obviously fantastic. The only thing I'd probably say is that if I were to make a good comparison on them, it would be that Esau is how the older brother should have been in the parable. Because in the parable, the older brother is upset. Essentially, that's the old Esau.
Yeah,
Esau. Yeah.
Look how Esau, if you read that verse, it's lovely how Esau does come to Jacob. Yeah.
So here, Jacob and in Genesis 33, when Jacob's coming to meet Esau, really Jesus had to tell him to, but it is to kind of set up this moment. Genesis 33 verse 4, then Esau ran to meet him, Jacob, and embraced him, threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they both wept.
So both the elder son and the younger son.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that comparison, I'd say it's really a better picture of what the older brother should have been, welcoming to Jacob. Because in a way, Jacob in that moment seems good, but he himself as a person hasn't actually changed. However, in the next coming chapters, he does make peace with Esau, but it actually takes a bit longer. But that picture is fantastic, and yes, definitely, the prodigal son, I think it's a great parallel. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's good.
Loved it.
Have there any more questions you're going to put to us?
Yes. So I've got one more.
And also, before we get into this one more, just reminding people, you send in questions on any subject, either the ones that we cover in the lectures, on the Bible, Jonathan's good on that, church history, PJ. I don't know whether I can offer anything, but I can maybe try and answer some. But on any of the questions on the material from any of the terms, or things that have just occurred to you as you're in your own Bible reading, or you've had a discussion with someone, they've asked a question, you don't know the answer. You might, and I was talking to someone just yesterday, was it yesterday? No, day before, and they'd had a debate with a Muslim, and they had a question that they wanted help with, how to answer that. You could bring that sort of question, but you can email them in, or you could raise them in the chat during the live, but usually it's better if you can give us a little bit of notice so we've got a chance to think, because sometimes we might need to look things up or bring a book or something like that. But that's what the point is. If you're a subscriber to the Bible School show, we want you to take advantage of this and get answers to your questions every month.
Yeah. And as you can see from these questions, you can ask on absolutely anything from dog heads to the meaning of spirit and breath in the Bible. Just tonight we've already had those. So any kind of question as related to the Bible and Christianity, ideally, we can answer, or we'll try to at least. Right. So I've got one more, possibly quite big question. So I'm gonna just ask this. So here, and this is probably to both, but a bit to Pete especially. Oh yeah.
I was going to say there is another question under it about St. Augustine. Maybe just ask that one quickly, because we mentioned St. Augustine earlier.
Yeah,
I think
we covered it
that last
month.
Oh, you did? Oh, yeah, okay. Right, carry on then.
But if you want to tune in last month, that was on the idea that Augustine sounded quite Manichaean.
Yeah.
Right, I wasn't here for that one. So, okay, carry on as you were.
Tune in last month to hear on that, and that's related to this question I'm going to ask now. Right, so is absolute divine simplicity a Greek Neoplatonic idea?
So I would say, yeah, it is. Or
so
even
firstly,
older than Neoplatonic.
Should we explain what the terms mean a little?
Should I do that and then hand it over, or can you do it?
Yeah, I think so.
Go for it.
If
First,
I've not been clear enough, do stop me. But yeah.
First, the absolute divine simplicity.
Right. So the absolute divine simplicity means that anything. Well, divine simplicity generally means anything that's in God didn't originate outside of God.
Right.
So that it. But absolute simplicity means that God is totally one. And you cannot see any division, you cannot see any distinction. So when
totally simple, one simple thing.
No complexity, whatever.
And particularly that means that all the attributes of God are considered to be the same thing. So explain that. That is the weirdest thing about it.
So the idea is like God doesn't really love. So when they say, "Oh, God is love," it's like, well, that isn't really true. They will say because like. His love is identical to his hatred and his justice and his omnipresence and everything.
Because it's all one thing.
There is. He only has one attribute, which he is. Because he doesn't have an attribute. He is whatever he has. They say things like that. He is whatever he does. They say so. You can't distinguish his actions from himself. You can't distinguish the characteristics from each other. It's all the same thing. So. That's absolute simplicity. So as we say, we've got when you see simplicity in Athanasius, it's that broader idea that anything in God he didn't borrow from another god or something. God is before creation at least, or before the incarnation. God was kind of self-contained, and then Jesus takes his humanity from Mary, but before that point. There was nothing in God that was same. So all his, his omnipresence, he doesn't owe to a God called omnipresence. Because there were some people called the Gnostics. They believed that God had to create, like he wasn't wise. He had to create a being called wisdom, and then through her he became wise. And so Irenaeus, he has to deal with all that stuff. And so that idea is the reason Christians started to talk about simplicity. But some people definitely go too far and embrace this whole Platonic thing. Because the thing Plato's trying to get at, he believes that what God is...
So is Plato this pagan thinker, isn't he? From 300 BC. He's not a Christian at all. And he his beliefs are absolutely non-Christian, aren't they?
Yeah.
He's a full-on pagan.
Yeah. Worships many gods and all of this, and
he offers a chicken, doesn't he, to atone for himself when he dies. And it's like that isn't one. Leviticus wouldn't say that's an acceptable offering, like a chicken. It's an unclean. But the point, it's like it's not an acceptable offering. But he imagines that is sufficient to sort him out. Yeah, he's totally pagan. And if he believes in any gods at all, it's the Greek gods and things, isn't it? Yeah.
He does offer sacrifices to like Zeus and others. That is his belief. But he happens to refer to a god he sees as higher overall. And as we've often thought about when we're talking about Islam and Judaism, just because you have one god doesn't mean you have the same god. And we've really got to draw this distinction with Plato's God, because loads of Christians don't. Loads of Christians are happy to essentially worship the God of Plato, and not just to say that, oh, Plato actually worshipped our God deep down, but to take a lot of his ideas about God on board to our ideas, to the point where it will contradict the teachings of the very early church fathers and the Bible, you know, the plain reading scripture. They'll say it can't mean that, and they'll make up ridiculous exegesis to make sense of Plato's God in the Bible. So it is very serious, and it's why we do take this seriously. And yes, divine simplicity has its origins in Plato, not in the Bible, not in like Jewish thought at the time of Jesus, or like, you know, any of that. There's so much, as we see the Dead Sea Scrolls and everything. The only people that talk about anything like divine simplicity are people who were very Hellenized, who had gone to Greek schools where they had to read Plato and Aristotle. So of course they take those ideas on board. But where there was no need to read Plato and Aristotle, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like, you know, Josephus and so on, you don't see this influence. You don't see this doctrine.
In the question, there's a supplement come in about, is this common in the church? What about the idea, is it equally held in the Western church and in the Eastern church or the Oriental church? How does the global church differ in its view of this subject?
So absolute divine simplicity is a phrase that appeared in a Western, like, ecumenical council, but it's not really ecumenical because they barely invited anyone, but in one of the Lateran councils held in Rome, they use this phrase that God is an absolute simplex, they call him. So it is quite firmly held by a lot of Catholics. Then after that, a lot of Catholics tried to really go against it, and you had like Occam, you had Scotus, you know, they all started questioning this. But they had to word things quite carefully, because this whole idea of absolute simplicity really took hold over the Western church. But then there were so many people questioning it that you think it wasn't as big as it was, but in terms of the official view, people felt like that is the official view. But in Eastern Orthodoxy, there was much, the questioning of it got a bit further. But there was still a lot of divine simplicity idea in it. But there were a lot of people pushing back. People like Gregory Palamas. He did believe, like, no, you gotta say his actions are different, and his like energy and the divine, the light, the uncreated light. You've got to distinguish that from, you know. So he does add some distinction. But there's other ways in which he says you got to have divine simplicity. In Oriental Orthodoxy, so that's like the Copts, the Ethiopians, the Malankara Indian Orthodox, and Syriac Orthodox, you know, China at one point, they were much more against divine simplicity, and they would often say we reject absolute divine simplicity as heresy. There's quite a few big theologians
I think
say that.
It is a heresy. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It is. So they, and like as we thought, Athanasius, when he talked about it, it's very different from the way Augustine does. And as we mentioned in the last Q&A, Augustine did take on board some pagan and Gnostic ideas, and this is kind of one of them, because he believes in absolute divine simplicity, he makes the persons of the Trinity totally identical to each other in every single way. Whereas Cyril and Athanasius and other Coptic and other African, like East African theologians say that, no, there are differences between the Father and Son. Nothing pertaining to divinity. They're equally divine, but they do have personal characteristics that are different. Which, like, Augustine's like, no, you can't do that. Because any distinction for him, it's like that could open up the possibility that one distinction is worse than the other, and then, you know, that makes him less divine, and so on. Whereas Cyril and Athanasius don't feel that.
Because John does that, isn't it? Where he just says, Jesus, who was himself God, and then a few chapters later, Jesus was saying, the Father has given Jesus to have life within himself, and Is it that Jesus does all the judgment and the Father is given all judgment?
Judgment to him. Yeah, that's right. Jesus. So the Bible does have those distinctions between the members of the Trinity.
And that they all need each other is an important thing. So part of divine simplicity is the idea that God has to be totally self-sufficient. And this is an idea from Plato. Because he wants to say... the reason he comes up with the idea of one God isn't the same reason we believe in one God. He wants a God that doesn't depend on anything. Everything depends on him in a way. A single, simplex... that's what he wants, because he believes all these categories, you'll get bigger categories so that a lot of little things fit into one big thing, and if you keep going up, there just has to be one that has no categories or anything, because if it had a category it would fit into something else. So he's like, no, you just gotta have one. Whereas when we start with the Trinity, we have to say that the underlying reality, because hypostasis is a word in the Bible, it means underlying reality. The Bible uses it to describe, a certainty. When Paul sometimes says we have this certain hope, it says hypostasis, this underlying reality. But sometimes describing a person, deep down, your underlying reality, that is what your person is. So that's how the Bible uses it. And so the underlying reality of the entire universe, there isn't one. There are three underlying realities that depend on each other. So you can't keep going until you get to a one. What's the one thing it's all about? You can get to the three things it's all about, the three underlying realities, the three persons, but you don't get to a one.
That's a genius point, That's the thing, isn't it? The Greek mentality, and in a way the Islamic mentality, because they've derived it, is we've got to keep dissolving things until we get to an atom. A non-divisible particle, and then they get to God, and God's like, no, the absolute, the minimum we can go to is the three. There is nothing further. You cannot break apart the three to find something underlying them. There is nothing underlying them. They are the hypostasis. They are the underlying. And then so there's this mentality that goes, no, but if we break you apart, what is the one thing we'll get? And the Trinity really is like, you can't break us apart. We are the foundation. We are it. There's nothing less or more foundational than the three persons.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they totally independent, isn't it? Because you think the Father, when he reveals through the prophets, like, what makes me God? It's like, I made the universe and I saved people and everything. How does he do that? How does he do these things that make him God? He did it through Jesus.
So if the power of the Spirit.
So if he didn't have them, he wouldn't be God. And if Jesus says, the Father's greater than I, and he's given me life, as he said in John, loads of great verses in John where he says he depends on the Father. So the Father depends on Jesus. Jesus depends on the Father. They both depend on the Spirit. The Spirit depends on them. Totally interdependent. And there's this theologian who's alive today. He's an amazing man. Father Tadros Malaty. He's a Coptic theologian. And he says that God is never monos, because you get the Greek word monos, which means lonely one. But you've also got eis, which means single or united. Or eis or maya, they're the same word. And he says God is never monos. God is never alone. God's never lonely. He is always maya or eis. He's always united. That is God. And he thinks, because the Copts, they think of Jesus, his nature. So he's even maya nature and everything. So they're like, you can't have like monos and everything in any part of God. And he's big on that. And that's why he rejects absolute divine simplicity. But in that sense, Athanasius describes where it's like, God didn't depend on something else to make him God. Like that we can take. But like absolute divine simplicity, where there's no characteristics of God and everything, we can't take that.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I was just going to do a quick... But I don't know if this might take too long.
Oh, no, that's too much.
That's too much, isn't it?
That's too much. We can't do that.
Right.
Don't even tell them what you were going to show me.
Yeah.
They've got to tune in other weeks to find out, but that is too much to do now.
The only hint then I'd just say on it is when they're saying, when God tries to, boil things down to what was before everything, it really does boil down to 3 rather than 1.
That's it.
But
Don't
that's
say
it.
any more.
I won't do any more.
Don't say any more because it's too much.
Yeah.
Can we just quickly answer Pippi's question where
Yes.
she says, if Plato is totally Greek and he's totally pagan in his religion, is there any wisdom that we can gain through in his words? I always think it's like there is things to learn from all sorts of people, like Shankara, the great, probably the greatest intellect the world's ever known, other than Moses. And there's all these people have some things where you're like, oh, that's a good truth, and you can learn how to do things. Like I can go to a college and learn how to do plumbing or something, and even if the person isn't a Christian, I can learn plumbing or whatever from them. But all the time, you've got to have in place the filter of Christ Jesus and the Scripture. And then you're putting that in place so that you listen to people and you'll say, oh, that's quite an interesting way of looking at it. But does it pass the test of Jesus and his cross and Scripture? And everything's got to be filtered through that. And the problem with Plato is people just take Plato and say, yeah, Plato, he's really clever. He asks good questions. He debates well. And then they let in tons of Plato or Aristotle or Greek ways of thinking. And it's like, you can't do that. You've got to put in, and no matter how brilliant people seem to be, or how good communicators, everything, you've got to go, no, wait. I will stand on no other foundation than Jesus. And everything must pass the test of Scripture. So it all must go through customs, kind of. And have you anything to declare? And if it won't match up to the test of, the only system of thought that can handle Jesus is the one that starts with him. It can't start with Plato. You will never end up with Jesus if you start with Plato. So that's the thing. Whether it's Plato or Aristotle or Spinoza or anybody else, read them if you want. There may be things that make you think, and there might be insights, and you might find... But all of them have got to pass through the customs of Jesus and the Bible. And then after that, okay, there's no harm done. But it's that far too many people don't have a customs department, and they're just waving through all kinds of nonsense. And I like in the Orthodox Church, they have a Sunday, don't they, for... what's it, Pete?
For condemning Plato and the pagan philosophers, and there's awesome traditions and everything about it, and like some don't like it now because like since the 19th century Hellenism, like going back to Greek paganism, got quite a bit of a restart in Greece, but that was the tradition, wasn't it, where you got to denounce.
Yeah, and the liturgy's still available, and it's there. That you have a Sunday every year where you pronounce curses upon anybody who believes and teaches Plato's stuff and the Greek philosophy. And I'm like, wow, that would be a refreshing thing if we had that. Yeah. And then we could add other kinds of philosophies in now. But for them, they knew the threat of that pagan Greek philosophy because it was their culture. I always remember that a great Greek Christian theologian said the reason we are so nervous of the pagan Greek philosophy is we are Greek. It is in our culture. It's in our buildings and architecture and archaeology. And we know that is pagan. So we're much more worried about it than you Western people sometimes are. And I found that powerful.
Do you know that story? I don't know if I should share it, but it's quite fun because Anastasius of Sinai, he's like probably the first apologist against Islam. Because when he first talked about these Arabs coming, he thinks they're Christian and everything, he invites them to these pilgrimage sites. And Jay's got a lot of interesting thoughts about why that's the case. But he's got this one story when it was that occasion where he denounces Plato and all his works. And he does it very rigorously, gets really personal. And then apparently that night, Plato actually shows up and he says, when Jesus preached to the souls in captivity in hell, he was saying, then he preached the truth. And then I rejected all my doctrines and everything at that point because I just didn't know better in life. And Jesus preached, now I'm not a Platonist anymore. So don't make it so personal next time.
That's funny.
whether or not you believe the story. It's a fun, yeah, you know, and that just to show that Anastasius, you know, he hated Platonism so much, he got really personal and got like.
And Plato was allowed to come back and say, "I've become a Christian. Will you leave it here?" All right, that's a funny one. Go on, you can end it off maybe now.
Yeah. I think just because we're coming to the hour, again, if you've got any questions that you'd like to add that we haven't been able to answer, please email them. I think the email is on the in the Bible School Show Podia, or if you've received an email, I believe you can reply to that email with your question, and we'll be able to pick it up next month. So next month, we've got, it's the first Wednesday of the month that we're going to try and do our live Q&A. So please tune in for that. That will be the first Wednesday of December at 5 p.m. And again, if you'd like to join the Bible School Show, if you're not a part and you'd like to, please check out the website link. It'll either be in the description or I can put it in the comments here. But go to the website. In fact, there's even an example show. So if you're still not quite convinced and you want to learn more, there is an entire example episode that you can just watch. And if you like that, then you can sign up to the Bible School Show and get all the terms for free through that payment plan. You can get all the terms included, in that payment plan. But we'd love to see you next month for the next live Q&A. Thank you so much for joining, and see you then.